Welcome to Democracy and Dictatorship. I'm Rohit Gandhi. And on today's episode, we want to explore the ways in which women have been included and excluded from the process of democracy. Through the centuries, women have been labeled in so many different ways, from being the weakest sex, the vilified, and the temptress, to the divine, the bearer, and the protector of cultures. The avatars and burden that women have had to take on are aplenty and not always justified. But through all this, one thing is clear. Women are an integral part of the establishment and the sustenance of a democracy. They're directly bound to the evolution of a humane and just society, one in which there is an aspiration for equality. Now, whether in a democracy or a dictatorship, women today are crucial economic and political actors. But historically speaking, the change in the public role of women is a recent phenomenon, a product of events of the past 150 to maybe 200 years. Let's begin this episode with a look at how the public space for women has evolved through time. Here's Beyond's Manoj Keval Ramani with that report.
She was once temptation, a seductress embodied by the biblical Jezebel, a vice that drove men off the righteous path, or honor in the garb of Helen and Sita, whose violation led to war and destruction. They were evil incarnate, to be burnt at the stake for witchcraft, as much as they were the spoils of war. To be violated as slaves, trophies, and concubines, an assault on them, an attempt to inflict deep psychological wounds on a society. Sometimes they were pawns, helping forge political alliances. From Assyria to Egypt, marriages helped expand empires, while the Chinese culture of Hurchin and Mughal emperors marrying Rajput princesses ensured stability between competing rulers. On other occasions, they were advisors, either as mothers like the 16th century Maratha queen Jijabai, or queen consorts like Wu Zetian, who wielded power behind the scenes. For the few who ruled, only a handful, like Malwa's Ahilyabai Holkar and Britain's Queen Victoria, have been hailed as strong sovereigns. Many others, like Cleopatra and Catherine the Great, have been vilified by history for perceived character flaws. Often, however, given the deeply patriarchal nature of society through the ages, the most important function that women have been expected to perform is that of providing a male heir. But with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, followed by the ascent of representative democracy as the preeminent system of governance, the role of women in public life has undergone a significant change. The first half of the 20th century brought crucial years of change. In countries like India, women were becoming politically active in the freedom movement. In contrast, in America, the war effort meant a historic increase in women's participation in the workforce and even in the army. The years that followed saw the principle of equality gain prominence, with women agitating for and gradually winning voting rights. Progressively, their role in public life and even government has expanded over the past few decades. For instance, women today constitute 22.8% of all national parliamentarians around the world. While that's nowhere near ideal, it's a figure that has doubled since 1995. Moreover, as of January 2017, 10 women are serving as head of state and 9 as head of government around the world. While these figures indicate changes in public perceptions with regard to women being in leadership roles, the fact remains that misogyny is still alive and kicking. Globally, 1 in every 3 women continue to experience physical or sexual abuse. Debates over women's attires and abortion rights still polarize societies. Even today, many women are killed in the name of honor for their choices of partners. And despite increasing number of women in employment, estimates suggest that we are still 170 years away from bridging the gender pay gap. From ancient myths to modern-day realities, be it in the heavens or on earth, it is the world of men that women have had to navigate. There is no silver bullet to ensure equality. What is needed is continuing engagement by women in the public space, along with the focus on education and gender sensitization. In New Delhi, Manoj Kevalramani, WION.
In nations like South Africa, it was impossible for women to find space in the political sphere. Our correspondent Inga Mizileni takes us through the struggle that women in South Africa faced to build their own political strength and to be recognized.
Apartheid in South Africa was not easy for black women. But they faced a double whammy of oppression at the hands of the white rulers, but also by their own men. Intimidation and gender discrimination did not stop the women in South Africa in their fight for democracy. Tired of voicing their concerns on deaf ears, they formed a group, the Bantu Women's League. The Women's League was mostly involved in passive resistance and concentrated on getting black women better access in the public space. Eventually, the African National Congress that has ruled the country since the dawn of democracy recognized the strength women had. In 1956, for the first time, a woman was elected to a political office. Lillian Ngoyi, who was the ANC Women's League president, also became a member of the ANC National Executive Committee. Clear signs that the ANC was finally ready to view women as equals. But the move was not without challenges. Internally, the ANC Women's League struggled to develop an identity and a consistent approach to policies. Eventually, an ANC Women's League constitution was adopted. Today, the Women's League has contributed many leaders like Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, who is the youngest woman minister to ever take oath, and the slogan that fired them on so many years ago is still alive. You strike a woman, you strike a rock. This is a theme that inspires many women in South Africa. Today, there are stringent laws against sexual discrimination. And if the ANC can help it, South Africa may well have its first woman president in 2019. For WION, I am Inga Mzileni.
The Greeks had a clear separation of space for men and women, the oikos and the polis, or home and the city. Through literature, religion, politics, art, the position of women and the transformation of their existence has been captured through time. It's time now for a short break. More on the role of women in building our societies when we return. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We are joined by Helena Kennedy. She's a barrister with about 40 years of experience in criminal law and human rights. Also with us is Sadaf Saz, who is a writer, cultural activist, and women's rights advocate. Thank you both for joining us. Let me start by asking you, Helena. Women and their role in building democracies. How important is it?
Oh, vitally important, and it would be hard to find a woman who wouldn't say that. But of course, women are not there. And we've got to look at what the reasons for that are. And we've got to see what the implications of their absence is, because if women are not at the tables of peacekeeping, if they're not in parliaments making law, if they're not on the higher levels of our courts making decisions, and if they're not in the public space debating the things that the reality of women's lives, then we see the detriment it is to the quality of life of men and women.
What you're saying is occupying public space. Sadaf, do you see that a very important part of women just asserting themselves?
Yeah, it's extremely interesting. In the 90s, I'm involved with a women's activist group called Nari Bokko, and actually for the Beijing initiative back then, we got together with women's-led organizations from all over Bangladesh, all 64
and
districts.
Nari Boko. Nari means a woman.
Nari means on the side of women, for women.
And Boko means?
And on the side.
On the side of women,
yeah.
okay.
And what we found was we had like in detail discussions with women on a range of different topics, you know, women and culture and media and law and their health and everything. And one thing was interesting because I grew up in England, and people have always said to me that, oh, you don't represent our women. Our women are not like you. But when I met women from all over Bangladesh, there was so much common ground that we had, far more in common than not. And there was a sort of spontaneous feeling that we need to come together and network and connect with each other. And in this amazing kind of national conference that we had in 1995, the two things that we identified was that was holding you back just because of the fact that you were women was violence and the threat of it, and also lack of women's participation, political participation, but not in a sort of party political sense, but in the fact that women were not visible in public spaces.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that has always struck me, in countries where there is outright discrimination, you can't drive, you can't go out without a man being with you, you can't step out of home after 8 p.m. at night, it's dark. How does that happen? How have we come to this point in our civilizations, if I may say so?
Well, you know, it's about patriarchy. It's about the way in which we've developed societies, where around the idea that that women were basically the property of men, and that for example, the sanctity of women and their chastity and so on had to be preserved, and therefore you had to limit the choices of women and make sure that they didn't you know, stray from the path, and that somehow women were inclined to do that was the notion. And so I'm afraid those attitudes have underpinned many of the, I would say probably all of the major religions, and getting away from that and the way in which legal systems have been about, you know, set up around those attitudes has been it's been a struggle, and we're not quite there yet, but we're on our way. But one of the things I would add to what Sadat has said about, you know, I now, much of my work is international now, and when I go to other countries,
you had some work out of Iraq, right?
Yes, I went to Iraq to look at some of the human rights programs that were set up after the Americans and the British and others had pulled out. And what one saw was that while there had been a great promulgation of this idea that women were going to be liberated and women would have rights, you speak to the women and they say to you, there's no benefit to us in you claiming that we have rights and putting them into constitutions unless the courts deliver them for us, unless there's enforcement of those rights, and there isn't. So that we've seen a return of a high level of child marriage, we've seen women facing still serious violence, problems that there are for women who are without men, widows in Iraq, and well, Iraq is full of widows, let me tell you. And so, you know, the problems that face women are in many ways similar around the world. That threat of violence, the threat of the threat of violence, the fact that women don't have the independence to leave violent relationships because women are often not earning their own money, and so the liberation of suddenly being able to be employed. So we need education for women. So those things are vital to the role that women play in society, and then having women in the public space arguing for why this is about the betterment of our societies for men and women, that there is that respect for the dignity of each of the genders, and to make sure that there isn't this sort of subsidiarity for women.
You know, Sadaf, you're Bangladeshi origin, but you're British, really. You know, you were raised there. Explain to me how that whole idea of, you know, women still not having equal space and an equal, you know, standing in society runs across, whether it's South Asia, whether it's Britain, whether it's somewhere else. Do you find that it doesn't matter? It just is a matter of degree?
I mean, I think it is a matter of degree, and I think what has happened is people often sort of think, oh, this is your culture, so we shouldn't touch your culture. But actually, patriarchy, as you said, cuts across
Absolutely.
all cultures. And you know, my answer to that would always be that, well, if it's in my culture, I want to get it out. And the other thing is this idea of culture not being static, it's dynamic, and there's powers at play here. So very early on, it was, and when I was involved with Nari Pokha at the beginning, we were sort of seen as a very sort of fringe, very kind of radical women's organization, and our idea was to basically, you know, bring communities in, have discussions, have debates, get women involved in various levels of government and non-government organizations, get their voices heard, get their concerns out, and, you know, really engage communities between men and women, and then realize that you know, the powers that be can infiltrate in communities and then become the power brokers of communities. So the idea was to get our powerful women in, have a voice, and start to shape culture in the way that, you know, is more equitable and fair and brings justice to women. And the other thing that Helena was saying about the state, I mean, that engagement with the state is very important too. So while as a women's organization, we never ascribed to very sort of highfalutin theories and philosophies of feminism, it was based on our experiences and what came out of our conversations and discussions. Obviously, you know, referring to basic frameworks of human rights and women's rights as human rights, but then to formulate like where we needed to lobby for what. And so you do need the state machinery. So we had a program where we would be monitoring the state machinery, courts, police stations, and hospitals for cases of violence. So where there was a law that needed to be changed, although we have a lot of laws, as you say, most of them are not implemented, but where there was a law to be changed, we would lobby for that. Where there was a law there, but it was not being implemented, we would lobby for that. Where it was being implemented, but there was an attitudinal element involved, we would look into that. So,
you know, making sure that patriarchy does not continue to pressurize women to exist in a form that really they shouldn't be existing, and they should be as equal as possible, occupying public space. Let's take a short break, more on the show when we return. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We've been in conversation with Helena Kennedy and Sadaf Saz. Challenges. How and why is it important to make those critical changes in the justice system? Can you give me an example, maybe, Sadaf? Let me start with you. To people's lives, you really see an issue and you say, I need to change this.
I've seen in the kind of work that we've done, one of them is acid violence, when young women were being disfigured and mutilated by having acid thrown on them, mostly by young suitors who felt rejected. And that was also, you know, she can't have me, nobody can have me. You know, we started in this tiny little room, basically like scouring the newspapers for items of news to contact these young women. And we would write to them and get, you know, because there was no other form of contact, you just like write a letter, hope that they'd get it. And then we got together with these young women, and they were amazing young women, but they would not go out anywhere. And then we realized that we talked to them and they wanted to come in front of the camera. And you know, we've got, one of them was a young woman called Bina who used to be a sports person, and she had her face completely disfigured. So we helped her get treatment, and the doctors came in and she wanted to come in front of the press. She wanted to show her face that this is what's happened to me. But her amazing journey is that she actually became a sort of survivor activist, and then started to help us and work with us to change the laws on basically containment of availability of acid. And actually over the years, that acid availability has decreased a lot, and actually the number of acid attempts and cases actually went down. Although it did come into a sort of really sinister other form in use for men against men, which was more horrific. But it was kind of an idea. It was kind of a sort of campaign where, you know, we actually sort of saw some results, and it was very frustrating, but it was also heartening to sort of see people gain their lives back.
You know, patriarchy at its worst and spine-chilling, to say the least, you know, throwing acid. Elena, you must come across many of these.
I've done many murder trials, and in fact, I've represented women who, after years and years of violence, have ended up killing their husbands because they can't take any more, and they eventually snap. And we had to really change the law in relation to this, because women were not able to invoke provocation. Because what men would do is, you know, they'd be angry with their wife, and they'd say, she provoked me because she said that I was useless, and so I stabbed her. And they would be able to use that as a defense to have their murder charge reduced to manslaughter and a smaller sentence. Women wouldn't, because sometimes women would have to think, how am I going to deal with this? And we had people who, for example, waited till their husband was asleep, and then they would throw petrol on the bed and set it alight. But what was not understood was that the women had snapped after years of abuse. And often that backstory was not part of the evidence in court. The judge would say, you know, it's what happened at that moment, what was in her mind. She wanted to kill him, that's murder. And so we started to shift the law and the parameters, and I led the way on the defence for battered women in Britain. And it was very funny, because I would go to parties at which judges were with their wives, and if the judge saw me talking to their wife at the party, they'd get very worried that I was inciting some kind of. But it became an issue for us in Britain, and getting the black letter law to change was one thing, but also it's about attitudes, and we have jury trial in Britain, and so it was very important to try to change the attitudes in the public domain. And so I've done a lot of the business of you know. Doing you know, work in the media and so on, and to talk about all of this. And the interesting thing is, exactly as you've said, Shadath, you start, as I started 40 years ago as a young woman at the bar, you started it seen as a radical because you were wanting this change, an end to, you know, women to come forward about rape, for women to get a fair hearing in the courts, that domestic violence had to stop. And it was the interesting thing was that then you were a radical. Then, of course, you shifted it. You started speaking about it in the public. You speak about it in a sane way. And you say, this is about, you know, decent men don't do this. We have to start talking about how men and women are relating, renegotiate the relationships. And now it's become mainstream. And so in Britain now, it isn't seen, you know, as being some sort of radical thing. You know, conservative women of many kinds will say, yes, but it's not enough, it's not good enough. And the Women's Institute, a very conservative women's organisation in Britain, where, you know, women who are living in rural areas and so on, they all want to see an end to domestic violence. They all wanted to see the end of marital rape, where, you know, a man and a woman might separate, but the husband would still think it was his entitlement to go back and put his key in the door and take his wife. And so all those things have been taken up by women's organisations in the mainstream, and that's where we have to go in order to make the changes. And so you need more women in Parliament, you need more women in the judiciary, in the legal profession and so on, but you need ordinary women to feel comfortable that the institutions are taking them seriously and that the reality of their lives is understood.
And I think just kind of leading on from that, I don't think that there's still that level of recognition that, you know, domestic violence is still a crime. There's still a lot of women who will also condone the fact that, you know, husband can still beat his wife. And marital rape is also something that in Bangladesh, I think we have a ways to go. I was part of this Asia Pacific Violence Against Women Task Force, where they were instituting the domestic violence bill in other. So we managed to get a restraining bill in our courts. But I think to recognize marital rape is going to take us a while. But I think recognizing violence against women per se has come a long way since 20 years ago in Bangladesh. Absolutely. I mean, I remember, you know, some ministers sort of telling me, oh, we don't have violence against women in Bangladesh. I'm like, because, you know, New York had some statistics, 1 every 3 minutes, this, that. Oh, you know, we don't have these statistics. I mean, now nobody would dare say that in Bangladesh. Right.
I mean, let me tell you that 40 years ago, I've written extensively on women's rights and wrote a book called Eve Was Framed, about how even in the Bible, you know, the story of Eve is about that she was the person that got the man to do the eating of the apple. But when I went up to Scotland to speak to the judiciary there, about what was happening around violence towards women, and they also said, I don't think it's so much of a problem here, and our judges are, and it was very interesting. I said, there's nowhere in the world where this is not a problem.
The other thing is, I think there is a recognition and also engaging men.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of communities that we've had a lot of success with, where communities have got together and sort of the women leader of the community has come and sat down with the man and sort of said that, you're going to be in real trouble if you do raise a hand against her again.
And that's the patriarchy. And
the other thing is that there was a great notion in Britain, and I suspect it's everywhere too, that this is something that's done by ill-educated men, by men who don't have education or who drink too much and then beat their wives. This is done by ignorant people, but that sophisticated men don't do such things. Well, there's a lot of psychological punishment that can be inflicted, and lots of other ways in which women suffer at the hands of dominant, powerful partners and husbands. So I think that
I think we see in all levels of society.
Sure. Absolutely.
But it's just done differently.
Yes, and in all cultures and in all religions and so on. And we have to also get the people who are the leaders in those religions to be talking about this stuff too, and not to tell women that they have to put up with it, because that's what is expected of wives.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Sada.
Nice to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Women have been pushed aside for way too long in many societies, but over the years they've made their way through the challenges. Women will continue to push the system until they can change the paradigm to occupy space, to build democracies and break down dictatorships. But nothing is absolute.